Let's get on with the next session. I have to apologise in advance. I have to leave at about 12:30 because the first vote on the Brexit legislation is due at about 1:45. It's not my fault that the government chose today of all days to the EU withdrawal bill, you know, and obviously I want to make my voice heard on this. So let's move on very quickly to the debate and the Q&A. We're joined on the panel by Robin Hargreaves. Everybody here will know Robin, ex-president of the BVA, here today in his capacity as a consulting vet, he tells me, to Agria Insurance. So welcome, Robin. Can I have the first question, please? Anybody? We've got 4 people around the room with roving mics. So can I have the first question? Who's going to go first? Anybody? The lady here, just here. Thank you.
Hi there, Jackie Reid, New Mexico. I'd just like to add something else in for consideration with the debate, and that is that I believe that the essence of quality of life is how you feel about your circumstances. You know, it's how about you feel about your circumstances, mine is about how I feel about my circumstances. So it's a very personal thing. And I'm sure it is exactly the same for animals. So I think that one of the important things for us to do is to try and access that feeling, that personal feeling. And we can do that by asking the owner specific questions about their animal's behaviour. And from that, we can deduce how the animal feels about its quality of life. The tools that my group develop have come up with a profile of scores for the dog 4 and for the cat 3. And these domains give us an idea of how the animal feels about its circumstances. Now we can drill down and see how the quality of life is changing. So as I say, it's just a different concept, and I just wanted to throw it into the debate. Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to respond to that first of all? Sarah? Robin? You have a go.
Just what I would say is that I did a little bit of talking to students and young vets and veterinary nurses about assessment of quality of life, and I think it does reflect on what you say, because the key thing is to start the conversations much earlier than we currently do. We're starting to assess quality of life at the point where quality of life has deteriorated, and we're trying to compare it with a memory of what used to be. Whereas actually we should be talking about quality of life when quality of life is good, and recognising it and knowing what it looks like when it's good, so that then people are, and prepare people for what to expect when it starts to deteriorate. So we should have people, they should be anticipating what they should be looking for, rather than trying to explain to them what they now see.
In actual fact, you measure it on a continuum. You measure it from the very worst to the very best. And that sort of relates to the first speaker, who was talking about welfare measures that measure the worst, if you like, or where below that is the worst, whereas the important thing is to be able to measure across that, so that we can make sure that animals have the best possible quality of life that they can have.
It should be a lifetime measurement across the animal's life. So you start at the beginning and you constantly measure that, and then you can see incremental deterioration and do something about it so that it stops getting any worse, rather than measuring it when it's really bad and then going, what do we do now? Because it's too late. So it's a lifetime measurement and should be looked at all the time.
Yes, and I think that's absolutely right. We can start off early on. We can use it as a general wellness measure. We can then use it as a therapeutic monitoring measure once these animals are at the stage where Stuart's talking about them, they've got osteoarthritis and somebody's trying to decide, you know, how their therapy is going. And then at the end of life, we can use them. Because I think the important thing at the end of life is that the vet has something more objective to show the owner that makes it easier for the owner to make that decision that, yes, their pet's quality of life has deteriorated over time, and yes, it perhaps is the time to call it a day. So I think we're doing things for the same reason, but we just have a different approach, you know, and I think that's the essence of measurement.
Thank Thank you. I mean, I'd like to move to Simon now before bringing in the next contributor. Simon, we have a question over the technology here. How can we effectively audit the utility of insurance in delivering quality of life? So to switch away from the vets for a moment and go back to the insurance question.
I think one of the quality of life and welfare issues is I think it was mentioned earlier on, the uncertainty amongst consumers when they're buying insurance. There are very different types. If you look at the UK market, there are something like 125 different brands that are marketing pet insurance. They are motivated in a lot of different ways. If you look at Hargreaves, we insure animals. That's what we do. We don't insure homes, we don't insure travel, we don't insure cars. But if you're a multi-line insurer, perhaps you don't have that same specialism, perhaps you don't have the same motivations. If you're a supermarket, then you perhaps have some other choices. Maybe you have the opportunity to sell on value for money. Unlikely you'll sell quality because you'll be endeavouring to sell down at the price point that your brand values suggest. So, for example, you buy an apple from a supermarket, it's going to be the cheapest, it's also going to be the best quality. They are phenomenal brand values. An insurance product, they don't sit there for very long, go out of business. So you make a choice. You either have the best, and your brand values reflect the best, or you have the cheapest, or perhaps you sell in the middle on value for money. Most seem to go on price. Therefore, to achieve that price point and for it to be sustainable, you have to have a more restricted policy. People don't understand that. They're used to buying their motor insurance off a price comparison site where it's all the same. So, we talk about 125 different brands in the marketplace, probably offering the best part of 500 or 600 different products in the marketplace, all subtly different terms and conditions, but banded into three broad types. Lifetime cover, which you all know and love, time limited, so a reducing balance until the benefit is exhausted for a condition over a number of years, and time limited down to, say, 12 months. So quite happily pay out for 12 months, and then that chronic condition, the shredder comes down. Sadly, once that shredder's come down, if you change to another insurer, that's a pre-existing condition. So if you made a wrong decision because you bought your pet insurance with the same mindset that you buy your car insurance, when the animal's young, then it could be that you've got that raging skin condition that's going to be with the animal off and on through its lifetime. At the age of 2, you're stuck with that problem.
Do you not think, Simon? I mean, there's one thing that's always bothered me. It's like apples and pears, because people make their insurance decision choices from their experience with car insurance, house insurance, travel insurance, which are all kind of cost-based things, whereas health insurance is very, very different. And people, I mean, it's almost an education issue. The consumer has to have more education about what they're trying to buy and more understanding of that product. And I think that, because I see a lot of people who, at this point, who would have paid more if they understood what the limitations were. They're drawn into the market on the wrong basis.
But I think that's two sides to the same coin. I mean, people would pay more when they're looking backwards. When it's a point and the pet's healthy, and they're weighing up the decision about how much to spend on their pet insurance and what that pet insurance might cover.
Except that most people have multiple pets, so they probably have the experience before when they get their next pet.
Can we just... A very interesting discussion opening up here, but I want to move next to the lady on the front row here. And if you can just say who you are before you ask your question.
That's Adele Waters, editor of Vet Record. I just wanted to pick up on this point about sustainability. And Simon, in your talk, you talked about the demise of the animal insurance market. And you also talked about the need for the veterinary profession to come together with insurers to come up with a solution. You talked about your dinners that you've organised, and you've got some intelligence around what needs to happen. What is the next step now? I suppose you've done that, you've got that information, you've come here to talk about it. What's the next step, and what are the options? What are we really talking about in terms of making it sustainable in the future?
Let me answer that in two ways. probably for the last 20 years, we've been endeavouring to get a level of engagement. I think the insurance industry got it a little bit wrong because their veterinary advisors led the dialogue with the veterinary profession. And a lot of those veterinary advisors went native very, very quickly. I used to chair the ABI Pet Insurance Committee in a long and distance in the past. I sat around the table. There were 10 underwriters around the table, and there were at least 8 who were there, 1, to learn as much as possible, and 2, to actually try and coerce the veterinary profession to charge less. That was a single point of conversation around the table. That was never going to happen. It was an incredibly naive stance to start with. The challenge was, how do we work together constructively to make sure this is a sustainable proposition? Because at 24% of dogs and cats insured, and sadly another 20% or so, even more maybe, that maybe have had insurance and have dropped out with a bad experience, probably never to return, whether they have 1 pet, 2 pets, 10 pets. You know, insurance hasn't worked for them, and probably the brand that they purchased from mean that pet insurance policy has been totally commoditized. It's not, that didn't work, let's go and see what Hargreaves have to offer, or one of the other lifetime cover policies have to offer. It's been totally commoditized, and people drop out of the marketplace. You mentioned, you know, the demise of the insurance industry. It won't go pop. What will happen is, we saw 2.1 billion as the aggressive forecast from Mintel as to where the market might be in 5 years' time. I think that's way, way, way optimistic. Things will happen before we get to that point. So we'll hit some threshold premium levels above which owners will just not see whatever pet insurance policy they buy is going to be value for money. So when you start to hit those thresholds, pet insurers won't stop trying to write pet insurance policies. What they'll do is start to restrict the cover. So, for example, maybe taking a leaf out of the book from the human world, we can pay the whole gamut of prices for an MRI scan, for example, almost determined by who you go and see. We might decide that a consultation, a bit of sedation, some configuration and some aftercare, you can see the extent of my technical knowledge here, is worth £400. Now, pretty similar to the human medical world. And if you've got clients who'll pay another 500 or another 1,000 on top of that, hey, good luck to you. But what will happen is, insured pets, there'll be a lot less MRI scans. So the insurers will start to restrict the cover down. As cover starts restricted down, there'll be the same price points. So that huge growth in premiums, I don't think will materialize. Moreover, as cover's restricted down, the value for money from the cover against the risk, against the premium that owners have at the moment will devalue as well. So insurance penetration, I think, will start to fall.
Okay, so Simon, while you've got the floor, I've got a question online here for you, which other members of the panel may want to comment on as well. And then I've got Chris on the front row, Chris Lawrence here with a question. Pets often rehomed for behaviour problems and referrals, I think that means referrals for behaviour problems, of course, are not usually covered by insurance companies. To improve welfare and reduce unwanted pets, should this be covered?
I think that comes down to individual policies. I mean, we cover behavioural and behavioural referral. I think, especially in rehome pets, that's quite an important part of socialising them within that family. But again, you look at, it's almost like your household insurance. You wander back 20 years and you had a level of third-party liability cover with every household policy. And endeavouring to deliver a cheaper household premium for people, they strip cover out. I think if you are selling, and some companies sell 99% of their policies online. They work through the aggregator sites and price comparison sites, and there people go on, they hit price as a selector, and they buy above the fold. So I think in general insurance, 88% of policies are bought in the top 5 when people have selected price. So it's that endeavour again to get the low premium.
Okay, I'm going to bring Chris in now because he's going to take over the chairing as well, so I'll let him get his question in first. Chris.
I think most people in this room would accept that lifetime cover is what is desirable. Do you think there's a place anywhere for some sort of control or regulation to stop people selling policies that don't produce lifetime cover?
No, because there'll be significantly less insured animals in the country. And in Gorf's shoes, if I was a veterinary surgeon, I would want a level of insurance with a patient rather than none. We just happen to believe in lifetime cover. When you go out and research what people think they've bought, all describe to you a lifetime cover. I wind back, because I'm significantly older than I look, I wind back 30 years when Cover for Life, lifetime cover, first came into the marketplace, and that was predicated on some huge complaints on the claim side of the company I was working with at the time. And we went out and researched 1% of the whole client base. We did 2,000 in-depth telephone interviews, and we asked people, tell us how your policy worked. In 2,000 interviews, nobody could explain how their policy worked. Which, hey, talk about indictments. That was a huge indictment for a very fledgling insurance industry at the time. What people described was a pool of money to pay for my veterinary fees. As long as I keep paying, it'll keep paying for the bills. Chronic, one-off and resolved, or otherwise. So no, it's the policies we believe in. It's the policies we think people want to have. And more importantly, because we focus very much on working with the profession, we work with breeders, we work with rehoming charities. They're slightly different, but breeders and rehoming and vets, very much we're there in at the grassroots. So we're there, we might get a bit of gastrointestinal because the breeder's not great at getting the pet from one environment to the other, but there's nothing fundamentally wrong with most pets at that point. So if you can get them on the right cover at the right time, things are covered. Things are covered through their lifetime. But I come back, some insurance is better than none, as long as people know what they've bought.
Any other questions from the audience? I've got the gentleman there. Just here, look on my right-hand side. Here.
Thank you. Alex McGee. So I've got two questions, actually, which is possibly a bit cheeky. So firstly, Sarah, you listed your quality of life tool as a way of communicating with owners. Has any work been done to make it relatively, without being patronising, owner-friendly, in the sense it's still a relatively kind of cerebral tool? And the other question was for Simon, which was, given the talk about quantifying animal welfare and quality of life, do you foresee a time at which insurance companies will require vets to make relatively subjective assessments about the quality of life of pets, and at what point we cut off insurance, or you cut off insurance?
Short answer is no to your first question. The tool at the moment, we're developing the software for it, and we're using it in research facilities for looking at the quality of life of experimental animals, which has to be used in the harm-benefit assessment. We've done pilot studies in other areas of animal use in order to define the factors. We haven't used it in that way to communicate with owners at all, because we haven't got the software yet, and we're seeking funding to do that.
Okay. Yes, Robin.
I think we've got a really big educational thing to do with the clientele, because I don't think our clientele really understand the complexity and depth of quality of life. They will ask me whether the animal is suffering, and they will interpret that as largely speaking pain. And if I can't identify, or they can't identify pain, they tend to, everything's going to be fine then. We can carry on. And we have to get people to look a lot wider than that. And one of the things that I say when I'm trying to get people to visualize this, when people get up in the morning with an animal that might be chronically ill or very elderly, they're making a massive decision every morning about whether today's the day they're going to have the animal put to sleep. And actually, in their heart of hearts, they're making a decision about whether today's the day they're going to kill their animal, which is why it's so difficult, because we use euphemisms, but what they have to do and what they have to decide is much more visceral than that.
Yeah, of course.
And the thing that I say to them is that's one of the big questions you've got to answer every morning, but there's another one, and it's one that people never ask themselves, and that is that they look at their animal and they should say, I don't know how rough you feel, but I've decided you can put up with it for another day. That's a much bigger decision to make than whether I'm going to put you to sleep on it. To decide on their behalf that you are going to continue for another 24 hours without the knowledge of whether that life is of sufficient quality is a much bigger decision than deciding to put them to sleep, because the implications are bigger. You put it to sleep, you can't cause suffering. You carry on, you may. And I'm spending a lot of time with people trying to get them to look at it that way, that you've got to, how confident are you that today's a day worth living? Not how confident are you that it's suffering, which is just a conceptual thing that people, I think, haven't got their heads around yet.
I've got the lady just here in the red dress on the right, and then after her, the lady sat next to her.
Daniela Dos Santos. AWF trustee, but also a small animal and exotic animal clinician. My question is actually similar to the previous one. I feel as a vet, I have a duty to provide the owners with informed choices, so provide them with all the options, but I also feel that I have a duty to the animal to inform them of what I feel is in the animal's best interests. A case I had a while ago was an elderly, morbidly obese Labrador with horrendous osteoarthritis who developed an osteosarcoma of its forelimb. I categorically explained to the owner that I felt euthanasia would be the best option, and they declined and they requested referral. This dog was referred to a specialist centre that amputated a forelimb off a morbidly obese elderly Labrador, and that Labrador lived another 12 weeks and never got up again. Now, the only reason that was possible was because this dog was insured. Do insurance companies have a moral, not legal, but a moral duty to say no to claims when the animal's quality of life and welfare is so compromised?
That's an interesting question. And no, the natural answer is yes, they should do. But again, we live in quite a subjective world. We live in a world that insurance very much has got to where it's got to in the UK because there has been that trust between the two industries. And maybe that's compromised in a few areas at the moment, but there still is that bond of trust. For a number of years, and across a number of companies, we've looked at how we introduce obesity gauges in terms of just as we expect owners to vaccinate their animals, and if they don't, we'll still cover the broken leg, but we won't cover something that the vaccine would have covered, because that was their choice, to put the same requirements around obesity and ensuring the general state of health of their pet is something that I think the industry would put in place if there was that magic bullet that would allow us to do that. Now, we talked about trackers and the pet Fitbits that are coming into the marketplace. Some that are pretty shallow. They'll see that the pet's been to the gate, the pet's been to the garage door, and it's come back into the house again, and guess what? It's decharged, and it will never be charged up again. But you've got some now that have little algorithms in that look at how much the pet's sleeping, the heart rate, how much it's drinking, how much exercise it's having, and you can draw some quite interesting conclusions about the state of health of that pet in there. So I think we're getting there, but I don't think we're quite there yet. And yes, to answer your question, that would be the ideal.
If I may, I think it's unfair for the insurance company to make that decision. I'm disappointed the referral specialist didn't make that decision because I think that's what you would hope where that responsibility lay. And I think that one of the ways to facilitate that decision in a way is to try and identify expectation before you start and judge against that. So if you're going to treat that animal, decide what you think success would mean before you start, not looking backwards. And also what quality of life is acceptable. Look backwards. And then you would hope that's a learning thing. One mistake would mean that mistake isn't made again. But I would think the responsibility lies there with the person who judged. Go ahead with that.
So if I throw that back at you, would you see that there's a need for a mechanism for you to challenge that? A consultation and what was likely to be done to the animal?
So in this particular scenario, the obesity was a factor, but as was the age of the animal and actually the underlying condition for which it was referred. I agree, I am disappointed that the referral surgeon agreed to do it when I had categorically said this shouldn't be done. But equally, the only reason the owner was able to afford that option was the insurance. And so it's such a multifactorial case with lots of people there, but ultimately, if this dog didn't have the insurance cover, it wouldn't have happened, and that dog wouldn't have suffered for the next 12 weeks.
But you've got to take into consideration there that you could have two clients with the same dog with the same condition, and the other one could afford it perfectly well out of their back pocket. You can't have two rules for the person who's insured and the person who's self-insuring. So I completely agree. The responsibility lies with the vet. You can't ask a financial services company to make those sort of ethical, clinical decisions.
Well, I want to say kind of locked into here, and then I'll be done as well. So I might be a little bit controversial here, but we're all trying to appoint. So I'm Fieke Molenaar. I'm the president of the British Veterinary Zoological Society, and I'm a zoo vet. And So we're all trying to point here, well, trying or debating whether or not insurers are responsible. So we're asking, is the pot of money responsible for the potential reduction in welfare? But let's just all rewind this. So we've got Daniela's story here of 2 vets, one first line, one specialist, that had different opinions. And personally, I think it is our responsibility as veterinarians to always, regardless of the pot of money or the owner's expectations, be the advocate of the animal and say, and really emphasize, regardless of litigation, owner's expectations, goodwill, what is best for the animal, and not for, like I work in a zoo, for commercial aspects, for public perception, for what they want to see. I am the advocate of the animal, and I will speak out for what's best in the interest of the animal. And what I think would be really useful is going back to the German story we heard earlier, where the veterinarians then have their own code of saying, this is what we all agree is the standard. And what I think we struggle with is the expectation of the public, due to things that are, for instance, on television these days, and people see what we can do with animals, and sometimes forget if what we can do with animals is actually in the interest of the animal. So perhaps the British Veterinary Association, as our member society, maybe when this new tool becomes more adaptable for practice, can make a really strong point of saying, whatever we do should be in the interest of the animal, and we might have an objective tool to actually support us in practice to convince owners that sometimes they should just stop.
Just a very quick remark to illustrate the difficulties of the different perceptions of what a vet ought to be. I was in a conversation with a client last year, and she was obviously getting very cross with me because I was trying to suggest that this cat, as it happened, was really beyond the pale. And when we really, our relationship pretty much broke down in the room trying to get this resolved. And her final remark struck me, and I didn't think about it until after. She said to me, it's your job to be optimistic. And it isn't my job to be optimistic, it's my job to be objective and to be an advocate for the animal. But that was an honestly held opinion of hers, that it was my job to be optimistic. And afterwards I realised it wasn't her fault she felt like that. And I was disappointing her in a massive way because I wasn't fulfilling her expectations. So there is a big piece of work, as you've pointed out, in trying to get people to understand what our obligations are and where our priorities should lie.
Sarah? Yes, I just wanted us to think again, quality of life. We need to think about the animal's quality of life. We're there as the animal's advocate. But you also need to think a bit bigger picture of owner's quality of life, the practice quality of life, your own quality of life as the veterinary surgeon. And if I can just use as an example, a case that I saw many years ago when in general practice. One day a dog came in, been hit by a car, major incident, major accident, major damage. It obviously wasn't going to survive, and you discussed with the owner. The owner was quite okay, fair enough, animal was put to sleep. A couple of weeks later, almost exactly the same scenario. Dog comes in, major injuries. The owner was distraught. And it turned out that the dog actually belonged to the owner's son, and the son had been killed in a car accident 2 years before. The relationship between dog and owner was obviously very different. Now, as the animal's advocate, the same outcome was what I was aiming for, because this animal wasn't going to survive with any quality of life. And yet the way you manage that case is completely different. So you have to manage these cases as appropriate for the owner, for your own quality of life, depending on your own circumstances, and the animal. But the animal's advocate role has to take priority. But how you actually do it varies enormously, and that comes down to communication skills and all the other things that we do.
Okay. There's a lady 3 or 4 rows down. Yeah.
Yeah, hi, Kendall Shepherd. Thanks very much. This just a comment really on Robin's heart, and I think in terms of decision-making regarding euthanasia, one thing that is not specifically in the AWAG scale, although I think it's an extremely useful tool, is we have to remember one of the differences between the pet owner and the animal itself is the perception of time. Now, Robin just mentioned about being optimistic. Now, animals can either be optimistic or pessimistic, but an animal only has the perception of what it's like at that moment. It can't be looking forward to tomorrow feeling better. It can't imagine feeling better or worse. So I think this is a very two-edged sword for the animal, because you can have, I think we actually treat animals badly because they don't have a perception of time and they just see a series of nows. I feel like this now, I can't imagine what I'm going to feel like tomorrow. But I think this is one way we can talk to owners and say, look, you know you're being optimistic, you hope your animal will feel better tomorrow. Your animal's only feeling what it's feeling now. And if it feels worse tomorrow, that's your responsibility to make that decision for the animal. So I think perception of time is something to really usefully point out to owners in terms of their decision making and how we might help them.
Can I just be controversial and say, are we absolutely sure that animals don't have any concept of the future? Because there's some animal psychology coming out just now with interesting experiments looking at their context, not our context, their context of life, and seeing how they can anticipate certain things. I've heard this said a couple of times here about the animal lives in the now like a goldfish. Are we absolutely sure about this? Because this actually changes our decisions.
My dog certainly knows if I pick up the lead, we're going for a walk. There's a lady at the back here.
Mervanwy Hill, University of Cambridge. We seem to be talking around this subject of animal welfare and the metrics that we have to weight when we're making decisions. And increasingly, and I've seen it increasingly over the last several years, we are putting more and more emphasis on the public perception and the things that influence public perception about animal welfare. And, you know, we all collectively groan when certain unnamed television programs are mentioned, and yet they are still on TV. And they are still influencing the pet-owning public. And there seems to be very little that we as a profession are doing to actually stick our heads above the parapet in terms of the public perception of these television programs and saying, actually, we as a profession don't agree with this, or we don't think that this is okay to be represented on TV. I do lots of work on commercials, looking after not just the animal on the commercial, but also the public perception that that commercial is going to generate. And there is a requirement by that industry to have a vet present. There is no requirement to have a vet present for animals used in films or in documentary series or in other television representations. Is it not about time that we actually stand up and say enough is enough? And you can't carry on representing animals like this because it's giving an inappropriate view of the role of animals in society and what is and is not acceptable.
But just clarify, you're not saying that there shouldn't be a vet on the set. You're saying that the vet or the veterinary profession should have some input into what is going to be shown animals doing.
Well, I think, so the situation at the moment is that if there's an animal going on a commercial that's being aired on television, there has to be a vet present, but nowhere else, and in no other form of television production or film. And so what I'm suggesting is that if there are lots of television or social media representations of animals that we as a profession disagree with, we need to take steps to ensure that vets are being appropriately represented in the decision-making process when it comes to allowing these programs onto the air.
Yeah. So it's the decision-making process that you're talking about. Okay, Fred. Have the microphone on, please. Try now.
Okay, Fred McKeating, AWF trustee. I've enjoyed the discussion. There have been very many valid and interesting points raised, but I just want to ask a simple question. Which, or all of the panel, how will you answer that question up there?
Go on, Robin, you're first. Never been shy.
In my experience, no, it isn't. You know, in my general practice experience, no, it isn't. It's enhancing quality of life. It's not doing as much good as it could, I think, because it is, as Simon said about the price points, we're ending up in my practice where, with access to interest-free credit and other forms of finance, the significant body of the people who are insured don't need the insurance. The people who need the insurance don't have the insurance. And as a general practitioner, yesterday, on my uplist yesterday morning, I had a Shar-Pei with bilateral eye ulcers that didn't have insurance and didn't have any money. It was 4 months old. I had a kitten with a persistent urinary problem that was 5 months old that had no insurance and no money. And I had a chihuahua with a broken elbow at 4 months old that had no insurance and no money. All 4 had 4 weeks free insurance at the start, and they'd all decided not to continue. So they had met their personal price point, and I then have the emotional trauma of dealing with people who want me to sort that problem out. And those people could probably have, there would be a price point at which they would have had some insurance, and for me, if they'd have had £500 to £700 worth of insurance, it would have done the trick. They didn't take out insurance because they couldn't afford £7,000 worth of insurance, which, to do what I was going to do, they didn't need. So there is I think there's a subtlety within insurance that we need to get to sort out, if I'm speaking personally, to help me in general practice, help my less well-off clients who can't just make an impulse buy of 60 quid a month. They just can't do it. I wouldn't deny, I would not subscribe to the idea that anybody who can't afford 60 quid a month shouldn't have a pet. I think that's an inhumane way of looking at it.
Sarah?
It's a simplistic question, and it's much more complicated than that, and you can't just answer yes or no because it depends on the circumstances. And I totally agree with you that it depends on whether they're sending the animal on to have too much done. And I think, yes, there should be a limit on the amount of money that we can spend on the insurance in order to make it more available to more people, so to keep the premiums lower. So we can do the basics, which we need to improve the animal's quality of life when it has a problem that we can deal with, rather than doing something that perhaps makes its quality of life worse.
Simon?
Let me qualify a couple of those answers, and it's absolutely not as simple and cut and dried as we'd like to make it. The average claim, I think the ABI published the average claim, which had gone up to about £750, and that depends how you define a claim, claim item, or claim incident across the industry. But at £700 as the average, there's a significantly more or higher number of claims less than £700 than there are claims above £700. It's just that decreasing curve. Therefore, capping maximum benefits at, say, £1,000 as opposed to £10,000 actually is pretty cosmetic for the insurance industry. So it doesn't make a huge amount of difference to the premium. On the one hand, is it compromising quality of life, to answer the question? In certain areas, absolutely it is. The vast majority of insured pet owners, it's not. It's giving them peace of mind, and the insurance does its job. As an industry, I think a lot of insurers will publish a statistic of somewhere like 96% of claims are paid. So it's absolutely doing its job in that instance. There are areas around the fringe where it's perhaps prolonging life unnecessarily. There are elements at the other extreme where perhaps animals are having unnecessary low-level treatment that they probably don't need. But in those instances, yes, there's a compromise. For the majority of insured animals who are just being seen, diagnosed, treated, and the conditions are resolving, or they have a good quality of life and the condition is under management, absolutely it's doing its job and it's not compromising anything. It's enhancing.
Stuart?
On balance, no.
Is that it?
I use the words for both of us.
Okay, Pete.
I just want to make the point that when there's a situation where, perhaps like that overweight Labrador who needed his leg amputated, one of the challenges is that euthanasia is always successful. It has a 100% success rate. It always works. Whereas treatment, let's say the dog might have had a 10% chance of successfully managing with 3 legs. And so, I think our job as vets is to express as best we can what the chance is, not being optimistic, not being pessimistic, being realistic, and then give the owner the choice. And I think it is difficult if there's a low percentage chance of success. How low a percentage is sufficient for us to proceed? And I think that's a very difficult one. But I think that's really, I think it's very hard to make an assessment retrospectively, because with hindsight you know what happened, and so you know then what was right. And it's just not fair to compare euthanasia, which is 100% successful, with treatment that might be 10% successful. So that was the point, really.
Thanks, Pete. Could you pass it back over to Frida? I can take one more after this from... No, actually, we go for Mike.
Frida Scott Park, Chairman of the Links Group. This question is going to come slightly out of left field, but it's very relevant to the question up on the screen there, and I have pre-warned Simon about the question. If you encapsulate the work of the Links Group as being, if an animal is being abused, humans in a violent household will be at risk. Last month, I spent 5 days on a lecture tour in Sweden, the home of Agria Pet Insurance. They have extremely expensive, eye-wateringly expensive veterinary fees in Sweden. You'll probably know Sweden has a very high quality of life. It's one of the best places to live. But I have to say, even I was gasping at the cost of veterinary fees. They also have very high insurance cover, but we have a fundamental problem. I spoke to a number of groups when I was there. If an animal is brought in to a veterinary surgeon, and the veterinary surgeon gets that gut feeling that that animal has been abused and starts to ask the relevant questions, and the person bringing it in admits that it has been abused, the insurance, the pet insurance, is negated at that point because it is deliberate injury of the animal. The big problem that the charity I was working with have is that if the victim, who is often a woman, 80% of the victims are women, bring it in, and she too is a victim, but she's managed to get the pet to get, to get veterinary attention. She can't afford the veterinary fees, so she's a double victim, and she has a really, really big problem. And I would really like to know if that operates in the UK, because it's fundamentally quite a big issue, a moral issue. So is insurance compromising the quality of life? I think fundamentally it might be compromising quality of life of both pets and humans.
Simon?
Frida, you did give me the heads up, but I still don't know the answer. No, if we compare Sweden with the UK, there is a hugely high incidence of insurance. So on the canine front in Sweden, 80% of the dogs are insured, 80, not 18. Hugely compliant culture and a pet insurance industry that's been around. I think the first dog was insured in 1924. So this generation, the generation before, and before that of vets have all grown up with a pretty buoyant canine insurance industry. So the chances are that those victims will be insured and in the 80%. In that compliant pool of people. When you look at this country, and pet insurance at 24% is probably the domain of a certain profile of person. Not always household income. There's usually children in the household, but the one thing that underpins the profile of people who insure their pets, watered down a little bit with all the brands that have come into the marketplace, is that they have a high propensity to buy financial service products, that they are insurance literate, and they're the people who have the extended warranties as well, and some of the other protection products. That's quite a small proportion of pet owners, 24%. So I would imagine in this country it's not so much of a problem, because a lot of those households where there's abuse by one partner or one cohabiter on another won't be the ones that are insuring. Situations where they are, and I know abuse can happen at any level and in any socio-demographic strata, but in situations where it is, at the moment, the pet insurance industry wouldn't cover self-inflicted damage on the pet within that household. Just as a lot of the products with breeders, for example, don't cover people in the same household if a bit of free insurance has been issued to somebody who lives with them. So it's just a facet of the insurance, but that's not an ideal world, and often as not, there needs to be, which again would makes life more challenging for our underwriters. There perhaps needs to be an element of subjectivity within that. The moment across the industry in the UK that there's not, I would imagine the incidence of it happening in the UK with insurance is probably not as high as it is in Sweden.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to have to draw it to a close there, I'm afraid, otherwise we're going to run too far into lunchtime. Thank you all for your discussion, really useful. Thank you also to all the speakers for their comments.